'Tis another Monday for transmission.
Morning.
Hello, Bubo.
Hello.
Bubo hasn't made an appearance in a while. Time for him to fly by. You know, since he's recording and keeping track of all this stuff.
That's true.
Might as well.
The robot
have
birds among
the
us.
robot birds are showing up. Hey,
Good
ZK.
morning.
Hey, Kathleen.
Good morning, everybody else who's watching.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Like we were today we're talking about how much is enough, and we'll introduce ourselves as usual in a second. But we were talking about how I got this sort of email from someone who's saying that we don't have enough of a reach, or people don't listen to us enough, and probably going to try to sell us on how to up our game. But it's funny, like how you evaluate something like this. Is this enough? Because if you're just, I've had comments like this before. Random people who don't know us at all will say, like, well, you don't have that many views. It's not enough. And if you look at this as a podcast, sure. But like, this is pretty much a live thing where there's tons of comments that we can't get through, as Dan was just saying before we came on. We can't get to all the comments. And how easy it is to fall into this thinking like, oh, we need to somehow have more people watching. The sort of enoughness question touches on almost everything in life. And so it's good to like have a conversation about like what is enough, because I'm assuming most of us are harassed in some area of our life about feeling we're not doing enough or don't have enough. Right. But enough of that.
That was enough, Mark.
Yeah. I'm Mark Van Steenhoek. I direct the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Walpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And as I mentioned when I shared this on my Facebook page earlier, this is one of my favorite questions. And it has been one of my favorite questions for a long time. I feel like it just hits at so many things: issues of the spiritual life, spiritual teachings, issues of capitalism and economics and society,
imperialism, and all the things.
Yeah, all the things. And there's just so many great examples. I mean, I've had so many conversations over the years with folks about this in different fields, and so my mind is sort of swimming like, okay, which example do I want to start with? And but so one of my most recent ones I did this fun little experiment, or not really experiment, but analysis, I guess, better word. And I wanted to see like how much living space do Deborah and I actually use? Like because during this pandemic, we were both working at home and all this kind of stuff. And so I thought, well, this would be interesting to see. So I looked at, well, what are the spaces in our house where we spend, 90% of our time?
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out to be a ridiculously small amount of square footage. It was under 500 square feet. Which, for those of you that know anything about houses and size, I mean, that's like nothing. It's almost a tiny house. It's a little bigger than a tiny house. And now we contrast that with the fact that the average square footage of the American home has doubled in the last 50 years. Right. So, of course, you think about what that means in terms of resource use, materials, wood, trees cut down, all the things, energy use. And the truth of the matter is that most of that space is unused most of the time. Right? And still you have these people that feel like, well, I need to move to a bigger house. Like I don't have enough.
Well, I mean, that reminds me of a story. I'm sure I've told it in one of these episodes, but not everyone listens to all of them, so I'll share it again. But Mary Joletti, who is kind of almost like a living saint in Toronto, she reaches out to refugees that come into Toronto and provides transitional housing. and she was meeting with a refugee, and the refugee was asking as they're having tea and she's doing intake. She's like, what are all these little houses behind the houses? And Mary Jo was like, what? I don't understand. And there's these houses that people live in, and then there's these other houses. Is that for guests? And they're like, no, those are garages. What's a garage? It's where we keep our cars. You have houses for cars? Was her response. And and again, like, most houses seem to have garages. We don't, because it's an old house that never, like, maybe it had a garage at one point, it was torn down. But the idea that, like, 50 years ago, having a garage would have been a lot less common than now. So, these things get normalized, and we need to have more. Like, I can't imagine not living in a house where I don't have my own office in the house. Like, but again, that's a luxury that never would have really, unless you were rich and had a den, you didn't have that. So these things get normalized, and you need more and more in order to feel sane.
Yeah. And we're continually bombarded, right? And this dovetails very nicely with the discussion last week relative to capitalism, right? We're continually bombarded, and in fact, capitalism needs us to always feel like we don't have enough, because we always have to keep buying more, and we always have to keep growing. And so, we have all these bizarre situations with materialism where, storage facilities is one of the fastest growing industries in America. You then have the endless garage sales. I've joked a lot about that over the years, especially.
There's like 5 television series about people competing over storage units.
Right. You then have to have television series about the abandoned storage units and what you can find in them. It's like mining storage units. Right? And what's very, very clear, is that there is way more than enough. If by enough we define just having your basic needs met. Right? That there is way more than enough. And, and some of the stories about this, right, become tragic, like, and bizarre. So, for example, everybody who's a sports fan knows that when you're watching a playoff, whoever is the winner, like, there's automatically, hats and T-shirts for the team that wins that says, champions, right? And what that means is that they've made both sets for both teams so that you could instantly have them. Mm-hmm. So I remember somebody once asking the question, so what happens to all the merchandise for the team that lost? And well, it turns out that it gets shipped all over the world to, quote, third world countries. And so people have found people wearing T-shirts that say, so-and-so NFL champion, but they actually lost that year. But that's where the stuff got shipped.
That's wonderful. I'd rather wear those than the actual ones, because to mess with people's minds. I mean, here's another angle to this enough question, because once you start talking about enough, and everything you've said I've agreed with, but there's a way we weaponize that. So it's the avocado toast analogy, right? Where there's ways in which we have more than enough, but individually there's areas where we don't have enough. Like we don't have access to things that are, not everyone has access to housing or healthcare,
right,
or all these things. And so then because we are perpetually bombarded with a lack of enoughness, we project that onto other people all the time. So if someone's like, oh my God, my kid's sick, that's because you wasted it on those tennis shoes. Like we get this kind of irrational way of thinking. Or like anytime anyone complains, like workers strike, I'm sure I can go talk to any one of my conservative friends and they'll say, look, people in Africa are struggling worse and you're being selfish because you want better wages. Right. So it becomes this weird free-for-all, what that does is it couches the question of enoughness on individuals, which is part of the pathology of Americanism and Western thought in general, of wanting to make the individual the unit of understanding humanity rather than looking at the collective of like, well, we have enough. Look, there's so much extra that Jeff Bezos has a city yacht like that. You know, you could have a family of 30 live in, right? But then somebody else doesn't even have like a house, and they have to look. They have to sit and have tea, and then look at how everyone has houses in their backyard for their cars.
Right.
That's where it gets weird.
Well, right. Yeah. Well, right. So when we say that there is enough, you know, what the scope of that I'm talking about is the world collective scope.
Mm-hmm.
But then, right, what you're talking about is that then, though, what happens is that certain people start hoarding way too much. And so then, of course, there are people who do not have enough and do not have their basic needs met. And, you know, and this is ancient, right? I mean, this is the basic biblical story of, you know, manna in the wilderness, you know, which is like only harvest enough for a day. Like, don't hoard manna for extra days. If you do, it'll rot. And, you know, and of course, there are all these people that hoard more than they need, and then it rots. And, you know, that's all nasty and problematic. Right. And so that this tendency that we have in whatever social system we're in, where some people are continually feeling like, I don't have enough, I need to get more and more and more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that sets up all of these incredibly toxic and unhealthy dynamics.
And this gets back to last week. Jesus hates capitalism. Like, if you can't, this economic vision of Jesus is very clear. If you look, especially Luke and Acts, the two-part gospel, I guess, where there's this clear message of don't store up money on earth, right? Like, don't put stuff, like, don't build a silo with grain and say, eat, eat, drink, and be happy. Tomorrow we'll die. Don't live that way. Consider the lilies of the field. And then all of a sudden you have the only time you see divine retribution enacted besides the book of Revelation in the New Testament, where Ananias and Sapphira hoard their money and keep it a secret. And then somehow, and I don't like this passage, but somehow they drop dead because of divine wrath, which I still don't know what to do with that. I'm not going to try to come up with a, but it shows the seriousness of this idea. Like, look, this alternative society of the kingdom of God, the church, whatever, however you want to frame it, has to be a community of enoughness where you share. And if you don't, it brings toxicity. So much so that somehow Ananias and Sapphira drop dead. Like, that's a big statement. Mm-hmm. And yet to this day, like, that's kind of, if there's any area of life, even more than nonviolence and that stuff, that people ignore Jesus about, it's the money stuff, which is overabundantly clear how Jesus thinks about it, more or less.
We got a few comments coming in.
Martin brings up a good question. Hey Marty. Enough is enough when you're grateful. It's different to each. The question of gratitude also comes into this too. Like, cultivating gratitude is clearly an important part of spirituality, but then it also gets weaponized, like we were saying. But being able to acknowledge the enoughness that we have with gratitude is kind of a big, important practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
CK writes, in the immortal word of Robert Smith of The Cure, blessed be his name, it's never enough.
Never enough.
Ceres writes, part of the not enoughness is that it is, one, a collective lack of self-worth. There is that. I mean, it's an insecurity question, no doubt. And two, a puritanical culture that demonizes pleasure and fulfillment.
Yeah, so that's a good one. So, and you know, I'm looking at your next comment. I mean, maybe you could say more about what you're thinking about that. What I think about when you bring that up is that because we're not allowed to feel good, right? Mm-hmm. We're not allowed to, recognize pleasure, recognize desire. We're not allowed to really appreciate things. Certainly within a lot of Christian circles, there's this sense of, it's not Christianity if it doesn't hurt. Mm-hmm. then therefore there is going to be this constant sort of angst of desire that is being unfulfilled, that is going to shift into all these other channels that that are materialism, right? So you get people who talk about, well, I can't sleep at night, so I'm up and I'm on the shopping channel, I'm just buying crap, and I mean, I can't tell you the number of people that I've heard say, packages arrive at my door, I don't even remember buying things, right? And so that is that repression of fulfillment that then gets channeled out in all kinds of different ways.
Yeah, and it's goes back to this. I do think that if you are enjoying the good things you have, you don't need more of the things. Like, that's kind of an obvious thing. And so, like, even the analogy you often give, or the example of different indigenous communities, which by our modern standards don't have much. We haven't. I think it's a fair assumption to say that they were more embodied in the way that they would live, and communities that still kind of live that way are more embodied, and so they enjoy things more. That's kind of, in my mind, it's behind what Jesus is saying with "Consider the lilies of the field and the birds of the air." It's not just like you should shame yourself for wanting things, and look, the birds don't have much, so you shouldn't have much. That's not what he's saying. It's like, look, if you want to see abundance, this is abundance. Does it need any more? Do the birds need more than they have? Do the lilies need more? No, they're perfect. They don't toil and spin. They're already beautiful. You're beautiful. Like, it's kind of a deep affirmation of pleasure in life. And so, yeah, Ceres also says, sadly, we, the West, are willing to weaponize the importance of enoughness and frugality towards marginalized folks to silence their desires, needs, and dreams. Yeah, we don't. It's funny how much our society will weaponize poor people's desire for more.
Right.
But we don't collectively do that for Jeff motherfucking Bezos.
Right. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, you skipped over our compliment.
This
Nice
heart.
heart. Yeah. That's nice. Thank you.
Thank you. I tend to do that.
I know. So I gotta point that out.
Yeah,
Gotta go back.
I'm grateful for the affirmation.
Yeah.
CK writes, having a front backyard, think about it. You need so much space that you have to have empty space that you just mow. Because someday you want to lay on that grass. You have never yet.
Right.
But you want to be able to do that. Graveyards and golf courses. Yeah. Those should be the same thing, because that would make golf harder and more challenging. And would save a lot of space. It's kind of like mini golf then, like with a bunch of obstacles. Perfect. They can even start designing gravestones with holes in the middle that you have to kind of go through. Like, look, I just came up with a whole new growth industry.
That's so sacrilegious.
Tom writes, perhaps whenever we have private property instead of communal property, we will never have enough.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, hi, Tom. It's great to see you, hear you. Tom was a seminary classmate of mine. And I think that we talked about that several times last week in terms of development of capitalism, how part of what happened was getting rid of the commons. And so, to CK's point, right, when you don't have a public space to go and walk to, and we see the way that public parks, all kinds of, public green spaces are constantly under assault, constantly underfunded, constantly being diminished in favor of privatization of everything. Right. And as soon as you have, this, it's mine, right? This is the Gollum effect, right? It's mine, it's my precious, and it consumes us and kills us. And there is never enough. Yeah, absolutely.
Susan writes, don't you think capitalist consumer culture propaganda is invested in provoking a scarcity, fearful mindset?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Enough ties in with fear. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it thrives on it. Yeah. It thrives on it.
Part of what drives imperialism, both, at national level, but partly why we go along with it, is because of fear, right? So the impulse to have things secured is not a bad impulse. Like, we want to have security. And so if you, but if you can get people to feel perpetually insecure, they'll always want more, and then you can justify things. So like the idea that we've been in war in the Middle East for forever makes no real sense unless you have a deeply ingrained fear of scarcity. I mean, our whole justification is oil and oil prices, and we celebrate when gas prices are low. Like, it's bizarre. None of it makes sense. It's irrational if you look at it, if you step back, but it's all driven by fear and anxiety, which they want us to always feel that way. Yeah. Which leads to a lack of sustainability. Jim writes sustainability.
Yeah.
Gus writes, the U.S. has been in trade war with Rwanda for the last couple of years. Initially, there were a few other overused goods and Super Bowl loser teas. They have added a tariff on used goods to protect small local garment industry, which is undercut by secondhand junk.
Yeah, and that's I'm glad you brought that up, Gus. I mean, I didn't get to that in that story, but that's exactly what happens, right? And all of these, and it's not just like used the used goods we're talking about, but it's also this whole industry of Christian mission trips and donations, right? So it's like, let's donate your stuff, your junk, to these other countries. And what that does is it undercuts all of the local small scale producers, right? So now this place is flooded with our excess crap. And so then, whether it's local garment folks, I've heard local pottery industries being destroyed by a lot of imports of super cheap plastic crap. Many, many examples of this, and it's terrible. And rather than us looking at ourselves and going, okay, why do we need to keep endlessly producing all this stuff? We need to do less. What we do is we just keep saying, well, no, I need something more. I need another thing. I need lots more things.
All the things.
All the things.
Yeah, because do you think Jeff Bezos thinks he has enough?
Well, this is a weird thing. I just started watching this show, which I'm not going to be able to see a lot because we don't have this channel, but there's a show called Billions.
Oh yeah.
And so have you watched that? Yeah, about these super billionaires. And what's very interesting to me about the way they're portrayed is how none of them do think they have enough. Right. And it's always about, okay, well, now I'm in this class of people, right? And they're focusing on the people who have more than $10 billion. So it's not even single billionaires. It's the group of people that have more than 10 billion. And, they're all then fighting each other to get a little extra more. And absolutely, not a single one of them is going, God, we've got way too much. We need to get rid of all of this.
Well, it shows like the moreness thing, like, anthropologists talk about this. Part of what money does in our society and wealth, affluence, isn't only about security, but about prestige. And so in traditional society, almost every human society has had a way of acknowledging having some people as more honored than others. Right. So there's different ways of designating that. Maybe you have a different colored shirt. Like, there's all kinds of ways that you could do that. But what in our society, you have to be seen as successful over and against your peers. And so that's where it becomes a numbers game. Like, they start using billions of dollars as a way of measuring their excellence, which is kind of toxic, and which leads to a lack of environmental and human justice.
Yeah.
Enoughness is important for that stuff. CK writes, the idea that wealth equals intelligence and greatness, and those who don't have wealth don't count. Having more does not make you better. Amen. Think about it. I use this example a lot, and I was part of this discussion. It wasn't my church, but they were deciding whether or not to have someone on their church board. And like, someone had brought up a poor person to have on the church board, and they shut it down because she wasn't successful enough. And this, You look across America, church boards tend to be populated with successful business people or people who are successful in their careers. And the assumption is you would never, like, I don't know, why can't you have someone who's homeless as on your church board? Like, let's ask that question. It's because we think that certain kinds of areas of success translate into moral excellence, which is stupid. Hand clap. I'm assuming that's positive. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm assuming that's positive.
I mean, it could be like, stop it. Leah writes, I have been wondering if by taking people's donations, this is a heavy and big question. I've been wondering if by taking people's donations at the Catholic Worker, we are just facilitating justification for more consumption. Maybe we should use it as an opportunity to challenge folks on their wastefulness. I mean, that's, obviously it's going to be hard to get donations if you're challenging people. But one of my favorite little books about donation, I think Henry Nouwen wrote it, a book about fundraising. It's little. And what he frames it as is when you approach donors, it's an invitation to discipleship. It's asking them to consider how they might use their money to nurture the kingdom of God, not only through your donation, but in their life. So changing their relationship with their money, which is not a great technique for extracting wealth from people, but it is a great technique for saying, like, what does it mean for us to follow Jesus? So I think your question is amazing and also complicated and heavy.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you asked it.
Yeah. There's a lot to say about that. Maybe we can say more about that as the week goes on.
And I think, by the way, that little book by Henry Nouwen is available on a PDF online. I think you can probably Google it for anyone who's watching who has to ask people for money for ministry stuff. It's worth checking out.
Our librarian guest will get right.
I lost track of her comments. Wow, there's a lot coming in.
Yeah. I think.
Okay, Kathleen, right, here we go. I have a tiny front yard. I turned it into a flower or vegetable garden. No more mowing the grass. I wish. Yeah. I wish we didn't have any grass. It's kind of a
this. I mean, as I said, the examples are so abundant, right? So grass is another great one. There's 40 million
biggest crop in the world, maybe even
the biggest. It is the biggest irrigated crop in America, right? 40 million acres of basically toxic waste. It's a toxic waste dump for the way most people deal with lawns. 40 million acres. Basically if you turn that into food, you could feed an enormous percentage of our population on a regular basis. And in terms of the comment about sustainability and justice, you would save all kinds of resources and pollution and all sorts of things. And it's largely a semi kind of useless thing, right? Like we'll see at certain times of year, people put little signs, kids need to stay off the grass because it's poisonous. It's like, what is the point of doing this? So anyway,
it looks good. Ellen writes, I heard on Beyond the Bastards. Is that a TV? Is that a podcast? In hunter-gatherer societies, people who hoard would be murdered. And that's one reason why we evolved sociopaths, because we need them to kill the greedy people. Holy shit. I never heard that. That's terrifying. I don't know if I want to think about that very much. Stephanie writes, advertising on so many levels. Again, like for advertising, CK brought this up last week, but Century of the Self, which is basically an essay documentary series by Adam Curtis, talks about how basically Freud's grandson was the pioneer of advertising in Madison Avenue. So the goal is always to psychologically manipulate us. And then he also helped get involved with helping the United States do propaganda for its military machine. So this is all interconnected. Yeah. Jordan writes, I'm right there with you. Awesome. Catherine writes, the nuance is so important. People shame poor and disabled people for prioritizing things like having an updated working smartphone. Yes. But our society also makes it really hard to access basic needs via other means. or makes it incredibly hard to avoid waste. With the plastic packaging on my affordable groceries, many times my choice is either to live with 5,000 semi-recyclable Tupperwares or throw them out. Some of the waste is an individual responsibility, but a lot of it is not.
Oh yeah.
They don't have to package it that way. They do, and then they make us feel responsible for what their choices are.
Yeah, and again, just the notion that when we start talking about any topic related to this, we being society and a lot of the larger conversations, begin by looking at people who do not have enough, shows how disordered this is. Right? So we need to start by looking at the people that have way too much. Sort of forget about, the other folks. We need to say, right, so who needs $1 billion? Who needs $1 million? As a salary, all these things. That's where we need to start. And to me, this is where this psychology of not enoughness is so ingrained, right? That we look at those who have obscenely too much, and those people are seen as the best people, the most moral people, the most intelligent, successful, responsible, competent. They're actually, the most disordered. And yet, right. What we immediately go to is, oh, gee, you say you're poor, but you have a nice TV. What's wrong with you?
You play video games. You're not poor.
Yeah, it's just horrible.
Stefan writes, there's people analyzing what are universal basic needs, including specific lists. There's a link there, autonomy.work/portfolio/income, not services. Though it's not that much about enough as a decent minimum. I mean, that's a great, and this isn't a new idea.
No.
What we're talking about, like Jesus again reframes it like, in this day, the poor people were shamed for being poor, and the wealthy were seen as great. And Jesus flips it. I mean, he really does. He's like, the problem isn't these poor people; it's these people who are hoarding their wealth. And I'm going to tell my stories. I'm going to use Zacchaeus, the rich young ruler, these other people as examples of how to relate to your wealth. Now, and that's what we have today. Like when we talk about enough, our mentality is to say like, well, I want to make sure that I don't have too much is our first thought, rather than saying like, who around me doesn't have enough? Like that's where we need to start. Is like make sure everyone has their basic needs, like really basic needs met, and then look around and also say, who's hoarding? Instead of like going into the individual morality piece, which we tend to do, like, well, sometimes I buy a second pastry. Like, yes, you probably shouldn't eat the second pastry. It's important for your own development, maybe to think about cultivating gratitude. But we can't get stuck in that place into this sort of individual moralizing. We have to look at society, and it's really messed up, and it's doing this to us.
All right, so we're over time.
I have logorrhea.
And we obviously have enough comments, so we gotta kind of blaze through them.
Ellen writes, keeping people insecure is also the basis for selling beauty. Oh my God, a whole industry. The internalization of not enough reaches beyond money. You are beautiful enough. Yeah, Susan writes, I would imagine that making more and more money is like a game to Jeff Bezos.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. Ceres writes, the issue of enoughness and fear-based propaganda is the reason why fair trade has not been taken seriously on larger discourse, despite of the win-win situation.
Yeah.
Great point. Leah writes, the challenge of mimetic desire, bringing in a whole other thing, and who we seek to imitate. Like, yes, it's innately, we might not feel this way, but we compare ourselves with others, which is part of how we evolved. It's a kind of a communal response, and that gets gamed. Right. Susan writes, I mean, it's not money earned by real work, but rather money gained by playing the system and on the back of workers. Oof. Yeah. Jim writes, unfettered capitalism and imperialism has given us purchase to take and not sweat the small stuff. Some great comments coming in here. Each of these could be worth a lot of. Yeah, thanks for sharing all these wonderful thoughts. Gus writes, the Seriously Wrong podcast, hilarious, by the way, has a great 3-part series in what they call library socialism, imagining society structured around use of things instead of owning things. Nice. So you have to put a hold on the luxury yacht. No one needs one. But not just big things, but all things. If we really have access, we don't need ownership. And we have to normalize the sharing. That's the other thing, is we're shamed into not, we could share stuff, but then like, well, I don't want to ask. It's because it's not normalized. We need to normalize the sharing of stuff. Ellen writes, do you think that billionaires have unhealed trauma? Well, I'm sure that's part of it. Do they need to lean into abundance? Lean into abundance. I realize this could sound like hurting people hurt people. Ugh. But I'm looking at how to have compassion on these people who I struggle to have compassion on. And I'm thinking about how uprooted people uproot others. I think that's a mix. I think they do have trauma, but they're also a manifestation of our society's trauma. And if it wasn't them, it'd be someone else. So the society is fucked up, and they happen to be the fucked up people in that place in society.
It's a systems thing.
But it's also like, I'm sure there's some issues there, especially with Elon Musk. Just, Susan writes, grass is wasteful of land, and yes, a huge source of pesticide runoff. Sarah writes, I grew up with a poster in our kitchen of hippos jumping into a rowboat. The ones at the top were smiling and drinking cocktails, and the ones at the bottom who could see the boat was about to sink were miserable. The logo was "More is not always better."
That's great. I like that
kitchen poster. Ellen says, back when I had a job that didn't cover everything, my bosses wanted to give me a raise, but that would make me lose more state services than the raise was worth. So I declined the raise. I've been there. I requested that the bosses donate the money to an organization of my choice instead. My bosses were shocked. They said, Ellen, are you some kind of altruist? That's shocking. CK writes, give me anarchy because capitalism kills. You idealist, individualist, liberal, you. I'm just going back to last week's comment. It's still sticking with me. David writes, when we didn't have the successful business guys in our church board, the successful used it as a sign that our church was poorly led and would never be successful.
Yep. Okay.
Julia has a link, iheart.com, podcast Behind the Bastards, episode
That may have been the one Ellen is referring to.
Thank you for sharing that link. Martin writes, haha, folks can criticize me all they want. Who criticized? I don't.
We don't get that, Marty. All right, let's keep rolling. We love you, Marty.
Yeah. I was notified the comment about sociopaths is against community standards. I hope this doesn't affect your show. Oh my gosh.
Ellen.
These community standards things. Oof. CK writes, Edward Louis Bernays. Yep. That's from the Century of the Self. Changed white feminism with liberty torches, cigarettes, giving them the power to be consumers. He's the grandson of Freud that I was mentioning earlier. Ellen writes, I'd be glad for consistently adequate. Yes. In so many categories of is this enough? The conversation could also be about imposter syndrome. Are you enough to belong? So many great comments. Julie writes, in my house, we refer to it as I got mines syndrome, hoarding resources while turning a blind eye to those who don't even have the basics. Oh, well, I got mines.
Yeah.
See, all capitalists are bastards. Oh, about a new phone. Yeah. Gotcha.
Disable.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. That's the funny thing. Like, new phones are not in our current society. We could think of them as luxuries because we didn't have nice phones like this 10, 20 years ago. But you really can't function in modern society very well, even like checking jobs and stuff without having some access to a device. It's intense. But
all right. Well, this was great. And
lots of wonderful comments.
A lot of great stuff for us to jump off with on Wednesday.
Mm-hmm.
And love y'all. And this has been more than enough.
See ya.
See ya.